So what brought me here today is my previous research, my dissertation on the gender history of the German Jewish immigration to Palestine in the 1930s, which I'm currently turning into a book. And for that research, I have reviewed all kinds of materials to incorporate both macro and micro perspectives. So I've looked on statistics, protocols, surveys, and on newspapers, and also on ego documents. When I did research in the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem, I came across this large amount of letters written by individual immigrants of this German Jewish immigration of the 1930s who wrote directly to the absorbing authorities in the Yishuv. And I found these letters to be a very interesting source because they are ego documents. And Chaim talked about that, and we'll probably talk about that also in his presentation. So there are ego documents in which the individual talks about himself, in most cases here. But they are obviously very different than letters written to family or friends. But they do share very private and personal information of the immigration experience. So, while immigrants to other countries, when we look a bit about immigration, not only to Israel, not only Jewish immigration, immigrants usually lack that possibility to write these letters because of the language, because they don't know the cultural codes and the formalities. And the German Jews in Palestine were in a very unique situation in that they could turn to two organizations, two observing bodies, the German department within the Jewish Agency, and the Tortutole Germania, which was the immigrant self-help organization of the German Jews. So they could approach them in German, most importantly. They could also anticipate shared similar background. So that is a very unique situation. And what I want to do today is to look on some of these letters and present some of the methodological points here. There are much more, but to give you my perspective. And I want to bring gender into this discussion in a twofold way. First of all, most of these letters were written by men and to men, because these organizations were staffed mostly with men. So we can look on these letters as describing gendered experiences of men, as gendered actors in this immigration process. And then secondly, I want to bring gender in a way that is a bit more tricky, and that is to ask why we have such a source script that is overtly produced by one sex, and what can we do with that as historians. And I think I will not be able to deliver on this grandiose subtitle of the consequences for historiography, but we can maybe leave that for the discussion. I will just, so you're not disappointed. Okay, so we can go and look on the first letter. They are all written in German. I have pictures of them, so don't try to read them maybe even. Where do I start? With enter? Mm-hmm. Okay. It's just like a visual teaser for you to see how these things look like, these documents that I found in the archives. And I will translate into English. So the first letter is by an immigrant called Kurt Beer, and he wrote to Georg Landauer of the German department in November 1937. And I will read this first one to you entirely, so you see kind of the structure of these letters. Okay, so I begin. Dear Dr. Landauer, I should like to point out the following to you. I am 40 years old. I was a lawyer and notary in Berlin. In July 1933, I entered with my wife as a tourist, and I stayed in the country. As a veteran Zionist, and according to the advice of the Palestine office, I tried to undergo occupational change. All my attempts, learning to become a carpenter and a shoemaker, failed due to the negative attitude of my employers. In spite of being physically disabled, a scar on the leg, I did hard physical work as a pu'el, so as a worker, that is a Hebrew insertion, at Assis for a long period. All my attempts to find a more suitable job failed, and so I was forced to trade in chocolate among my acquaintances in Tel Aviv. Our financial situation worsened more and more because my wife could no longer work after she gave birth to our son in 1935. Our physical exhaustion, the illegality, and the severe economic situation forced us in July 1937 to move to relatives in Prague, who can temporarily host us. Once we will receive the certificate, so the immigration permit, we intend to return. However, we will be left with nothing, and that with a small child. I am turning to you, dear Dr. Landauer, hoping that with your help and will be able to find a humble income in Eretz Israel. Sincerely, Kurt Beer. So when we look, I was trained as a historian in Germany, so with a German Ranke tradition of source criticism. So when we look on the outer critique, as we like to call it, and we look first of all on the author and recipient of this letter, we have Kurt Beer, who was an illegal immigrant, as he stayed after his tourist permit ended, and he writes from Prague to Georg Landauer. Georg Landauer was the executive secretary of the German department, one of the highest ranking members of that organization, and he was not personally known to Kurt Beer. The goal of this letter of Beer is to make Landauer intercede on his behalf to find a more suitable job, as he puts it. And we can see that he's beginning with an introduction, mentioning a few points that are regarded by Kurt Beer as essential for Landauer. So he's talking about his age, his former profession, the place where he lived in Germany, Berlin, as well, and that is very important here, as well as belonging to the Zionist organization. He says, I'm an alter Zionist, a veteran Zionist, and that is a code word for members of the Zionist organizations before 1933, while those who joined after 1993 were kind of looked at in a derogatory way as new Zionists. That's very important. So he complains that even though he's a veteran Zionist, even though he underwent occupational change, and he worked in various blue-collar jobs, he failed economically. And the reason for that, in his mind, is, as he says, the negative attitude of his employers. Now, he doesn't further explain that, and this is pretty much taken for granted. After all, Landauer was one of his own Landsmannschaft, so to speak, that there was this very common mistreatment of the Yekis in the veteran society. So he doesn't need to explain that. That is self-understood. His illegal status and the birth of his child add to this situation, to this crisis that he is in. And to explain this, this is a very extreme move. I mean, move in a double sense. He's moving to Prague, which is obviously not a Zionist move to leave Eretz Israel. And he explains that with pointing out that his wife could no longer work after giving birth to the child, and his income alone was not enough to support the family. Also, this is not explained. It doesn't need to be explained at this point that a married wife is working, but the opposite, why the married wife is not working anymore, and that points to the decisive meaning of female employment in this immigration wave. And another thing that we see here is the importance of private networks, a most precious capital of immigrants in general, everywhere, because it enables Beer to overcome this crisis abroad with his family in Prague. This is obviously a move that he invested money, they invested effort. It was not an easy thing to do. And it indicates, I think, the level of despair of this family, especially in the light of the political developments in Nazi Germany at that point. And I want to draw your attention to the way in that Beer makes this case and presents this information. Because he's not simply asking for help. He's communicating his understanding of the situation that he finds himself in as unjust. And he also communicates that he is aware of the normative requirements of the absorbing authority, so of Landauer. He did everything right, is what he says. He highlights that he was a Zionist, he was in the movement, he acted according to their advice. He's well aware also of the position of the authorities that married women were expected to work. And he also deploys the elements of age and former profession and his health. You mentioned the scar at the leg. And all of these were constantly discussed in the current discourse of the apparatus as problematic elements of this immigration wave. So he shows, despite all of that, I was willing to do what you told me, and still I failed. And he describes a very dramatic downward social mobility of a man who was once established in a profession with a secure income. He became a worker, which was obviously already a social decline, but it was compensated through the framework of Zionism. And then he fails in that too and becomes a small trader in the informal sector, which is not acceptable neither in the framework of Zionism nor obviously in the framework of German Jewish middle class norms. And he believes that Landauer should and will understand the situation. So this letter is a very typical example of this genre of hundreds of such letters that I found in the Central Zionist Archives. Most of these letters follow this pattern. Obviously the formal way of writing, the introduction. They also have a similarity in structure, which is logical, but it helps us, I think, to look on these sources. And that is that each of the letters is written because of a problem. Each of the letters pursues a specific goal to overcome this problem that the immigrant faces. And it also points out why the writer is entitled to help. So we can look on that for kind of learn something about the social context of the author, but also about the specific world of thought of this respective author. They all touch on the same experiences of male immigrants, that is, unsuccessful occupational change, the importance of female work, social downward mobility, conflicts in the workplace, lack of integration into the society, and also about the body, the age, a lot of psychological problems, etc. This undertone of frustration and complaint is also present in most of these letters. So it's not the only goal of these letters, is the point they're trying to make, to ask for help, but it's also to vent the anger that these men, immigrant male, felt that they were treated deeply unfairly, and they wanted to communicate that. This is also, by the way, maybe not the behavior you would expect of new immigrants appealing to authorities. So to show you another letter, and I will not read the entire letter, it's really long, as you can see here. This letter is written by Hans Falkenstein. He was at that time aged 35, and he also wrote to Landau in 1938. And I quote one part of that letter. A Zionist, an active member of the movement, well prepared, who speaks Hebrew and English, is after 2.5 years in the country left with nothing. It is not that I did something wrong or was not adequate to the task, but nobody gave me a chance. I do not know if you, Dr. Landauer, can understand what it means to be on the outside like this. Also, I will have to take care of my parents very soon now. The doctor's office of my wife supports us currently with great difficulty, but can't support 4 persons, and we have no savings. So it is of utmost importance that I will get help now. I appeal to you, do not just put this letter away, because who else can I turn to? That's the second part. So Falkenstein had been a judge in Germany, and we can see here the problem that he describes, obviously, is that he is unemployed, without income, subsists from the doctor's office of his wife, but will have to take care of his parents very soon. This is talking about the parent immigration, so the immigration of the elderly parents of immigrants. So they are in financial distress. And his age, 35 years, is, like he writes, I quote, "It is almost impossible to integrate somebody my age in the workforce." These men were labeled from 35 onwards, were labeled as old men in the official discourse. They were seen as one of the hardest groups to integrate. Also, he did everything right, as he says, in his view. He was also a member of the Zionist movement, he learned Hebrew, etc., but he failed, and he doesn't feel integrated into the Yeshu society. So this fact that immigrants don't feel integrated and feel uprooted is obviously also very common for immigrants, but here we have an immigrant who communicates that he's not accepting this situation. He deserves to be treated better, it's what he says. And that is for 2 reasons. One is, again, his membership in the Zionist movement and the fact that he did everything right. And then there's a second point, and he doesn't say that explicitly, but in his introduction, which I didn't read to you, he talks at length about not only that he was a judge, but what exact exams he did, what professional specializations he had gained, etc. And this information is not relevant to the observing apparatus. He would not be able to work as a judge or a lawyer or notary or anything in Palestine, obviously. It is, though, very relevant for him as an individual, and he wants to communicate, those are my achievements and I'm not willing to wipe them out. This is a sort of pride for him, so he communicates it. He enters it into this letter. He can't stand this chasm between his old life and the new life. And he's unwilling to accept the verdict of being an immigrant, which is essentially starting from zero, being an outsider and being unemployed. So he's not accepting that. And let's have a look on one more letter. This is a letter by Shlomo Jüngster, who wrote to Moshe Brachman of the Tel Aviv branch of the Historiography Germania. So that is the immigrant self-help organization. Both were very much connected. He wrote that letter in 1937. I quote, "Of course I'm a member of the Historiography, and since I became unemployed, I attended their labor exchange for metal workers 3 times a week. But until this day, I haven't got even 1 day of work. It is without question that workers were needed during this period, be it in my profession or some kind of avodah shchora. But I, who always asked politely, was always put off from day to day. Meanwhile others, even single men got work, those who stood out through being rowdies. All those, as one says, who enjoy protectia from the highest ranks. However, it is not my character to gain attention in such a way, and I still believe in justice. I want to mention, by the way, that I'm not in arrears with my payments for the Historiography, even though it was extraordinarily difficult for me to pay them. Naively, I believed that I was more likely to be considered because of that, but also here I was wrong." End of the quotation. So he was, due to the economic crisis, he was fired, didn't find a job again. He also, we see the pattern already, subsists from the income of his wife in these first years. And in his understanding, the reason that he doesn't find a job is firstly because to get a job from the Historiography, you need to perform a certain kind of masculinity. So Jüngster, as he said, he behaves calmly, politely, according to the norms that he learned in Germany to be the right ones. And now he's confronted with quite the opposite behavior. Those who are loud and aggressive, who don't stand in line, they get the jobs and not him. And in addition, he is not part of the right network. He talks about those enjoying protectia, which is, by the way, a clear reference to Eastern European Jews from a German Jew. Those get the jobs too. And he finds this clique, kind of the Historiography and the veteran workers, as closed. He has no possibility to enter this network. So he expresses this frustration of an immigrant who is neither integrated into the workforce nor into the Yeshuv society. And the interesting thing about this letter is that the goal of the letter is not clearly expressed. He says at one point, "Get me out of this terrible situation." So he turns to the Historiography Germania, apparently hoping that a German, quote-unquote, authority will be able to relate and to understand him and help them. But it is also more of an abstract wish to be heard and to make his voice be heard about the frustration that he feels. So I just want to sum up what I make of these letters before I move on. These letters provide descriptions of the hardships that immigrant men had to face, lack of integration into the labor market, into the society, not being in the right networks. And these hardships are clearly gendered. Their image of their masculinity changes from able, strong providers. Now are they dependent on the income of their wives. They have to ask the authorities for help, which is probably not something they had to do before, those who came early, after 1933. And then also, unintentionally, maybe they show us more about how immigrants actually coped with that situation. They relied on networks, there were shifting work patterns within the families, and they tried to rebuild or build networks. We are not looking on the experience of the male immigrant from Germany per se here. We're looking on the experience of a group of authors who were prone to this experience as crisis because they belonged to two groups who were labeled very problematic. I'm saying this now from a macro perspective. So there were veteran Zionists, and that was a group that maybe sound like counterintuitively, but that was a group who was expected to be most disappointed by the reality of Palestine. And we're talking about men over the age of 35 who were constantly labeled as too old, who were considered in Germany men in their prime, and here they're labeled as too old, hard to integrate, not able to meet the physical requirements of the job. when, from a methodological point of view, an obvious question would be, do they exaggerate the gravity of their problems in order to receive help? And they do not just describe social reality, obviously. They use writing techniques. They use a very formal style. They use an introduction. They point out that they meet the normative requirements of the authorities. And also this constant mentioning of the female spouse who is working is not just describing reality. It shows that they understand the conceptual framework of the authorities who expect the wives to work as well. So we can't take all these documents obviously for face value, including the element of the Zionist activity. But the statements of despair and hopelessness are backed by many, many other sources. And also we need to remember that they were probably not in contact with welfare before, and this disclosing of most intimate problems is an act of despair. So concluding part, I want to look on the fact how can we understand this abundance of such letters by men and the scarcity of such letters by women. When we have such a source group that is overtly produced by one sex, that is a crucial point in my mind for us as historians, to think about what that could be. So was immigration easier for women than for men, so they had no reason to complain? I don't think that is true, as somebody who studied the social history of this immigration wave, but it's not just a rhetoric question. There was, in the 1930s, in the Absorption Apparatus and in the German Jewish community, a very strong narrative of women of valor, of Eshet Chayil, die tapferen Frauen. So female immigrants were constantly lauded in the 30s for taking up every job, being brave and determined and still caring for the family. And strikingly, something that is always mentioned is that they did all of them, they did not complain. And this narrative is present and echoed also in the research literature of this group of immigrants. So for a gender historian, obviously, when we hear about sacrificing themselves in silence without complaining, this is a normative idea of femininity, both in the cultural religious framework as well as in a previous debate of German Jewry in the 1930s under the shadow of National Socialism, where we see already the same debate. Women are now expected to work as well, but they still have to do the homemaking, they still have to ease the emotional distress in their families, etc. So this discourse was obviously imported to Palestine. And my point is, it is likely that female immigrants did not complain in such letters to the same degree than men, because they know exactly what was expected of them, and that was to be strong and to be silent. And then the other point is we also have to think about the recipients of these letters. Those were mostly men, often the fraternity brothers of these men, and there was a general favorable understanding that they could write to them, they would be listened to. So I will conclude that these letters provide, in my mind, a quite unique type of eco-documents that can shed light on the connection between the micro perspective and the macro perspective. And I did not get to the historiography, but they shed light on these early absorption struggles, and this is something that is usually not part of the narrative in the historiography of the Yekis. That is in my mind because other ego documents are used that concentrate on success stories, like memoirs, for example. So these stories who are about failure are not present. So it is very important to read these documents, and it is also important, last sentence, that we read them together with contemporary sources, and we look not only about who is writing to whom, when and why, but also who is not writing and why that could be, so that we investigate the possibilities of different immigrants, of men and women to be heard. Thank you very much. Wow,